The alarm on my wrist device would not stop buzzing, and my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my data tablet on the chamber floor. Every seat in the Galactic Assembly was full. Every screen showed the same red warning banner, and every single delegate in that massive circular hall was staring at one empty podium, waiting for someone from the human Concordat to step forward and explain what was happening. My name is Ethan Cole, and at that moment I was just a junior aide standing behind the human delegation, holding a stack of papers nobody would ever read. I had no idea that in the next few minutes I would watch the balance of the entire galaxy crack open. The human delegate, a tall woman named Grace Whitfield, walked to the podium without any notes. She did not look nervous. She did not look angry either. She looked tired, the way someone looks after carrying something heavy for far too long and finally deciding to set it down. "Members of the Assembly," she said, her voice calm and steady through the translation system. "The human Concordat is formally withdrawing from all galactic treaties, councils, and cooperative agreements, effective immediately." For a moment, nobody reacted. I think most of the room believed they had misheard the translation. Then the noise started. Delegates from a dozen species began shouting over each other, demanding explanations, demanding she take it back, demanding to know what humanity wanted in exchange. Grace did not raise her voice. She simply waited until the noise settled enough for her to be heard again. "We are not asking for anything," she said. "We are not making demands. We are leaving. Our ships are already returning home. Our engineers are already being recalled from your relay stations. Our peacekeepers are already leaving the border systems they have patrolled for the last several decades." A Trellian senator named Cale Dorsa stood up from his seat near the front. He was the same senator who, only 3 weeks earlier, had stood in this very chamber and called humanity reckless children who did not deserve a permanent seat on the Security Council. He had said it with a smile, and half the room had laughed along with him. He was not smiling now. "This is theater," Cale said. "You cannot simply walk away from your responsibilities. You have commitments, treaties, obligations to species who depend on your support." Grace looked at him for a long moment before she answered. "For 80 years, she said, we patrolled your trade lanes for free. We built and maintained the relay network that lets half this assembly even hold a meeting like this one. We mediated conflicts between empires older than our entire species, and in return, we were mocked, dismissed, and treated like unwanted guests at a table we built ourselves." She paused, and I remember the silence in that chamber being the loudest sound I had ever heard. 3 weeks ago, one of our engineers was killed while repairing a relay station that belonged to the Trellian Compact. Senator Dorsa, your government called it an unfortunate accident and closed the case within a day. We asked for a proper investigation. You refused. So today, we are done asking for anything from any of you." I watched Cale's face change from irritation to something closer to alarm, but he recovered quickly, forcing a small laugh. "You will come crawling back within a month," he said. "Your economy depends on our trade routes as much as ours depends on yours." Grace gathered her notes and stepped back from the podium. "We built our own trade routes decades ago," she said. "We simply chose to share ours with you. That choice has now ended." Then she walked out of the chamber, followed by the rest of the human delegation. I followed too, glancing back once at the stunned faces filling that enormous room. Some delegates were already whispering frantically to their aides. Others sat frozen, staring at the empty podium as if it might explain itself. Outside the chamber, the hallway was strangely quiet. Human staff were already packing files into secure cases. Nobody spoke much. There was no celebration, no anger, just quiet, careful movement, like a family packing up a house they had lived in for generations, knowing they were never coming back. I caught up to Grace near the transport terminal. "Is this really happening?" I asked her. "All of it? Every treaty, every station, every agreement?" She looked at me, and for the first time that day, I saw something softer in her expression, something almost sad. "Every single one," she said. We have spent decades holding pieces of this galaxy together, with our own hands, Ethan, while they told us we were not good enough to sit at their table as equals. So we are letting go, all of it, all at once. What happens now? I asked. Now, she said, stepping onto the transport. We watch. I stood on that platform for a long time after she left, watching the last human shuttles depart the orbital station one after another, their engines glowing against the dark sky. Assembly ships drifted nearby, confused, waiting for instructions that were not coming. Alarms continued to sound faintly through the station's corridors, warning of relay stations going offline one by one across a dozen systems. I did not know it then, but that quiet evening was the last calm moment the galaxy would experience for a very long time. Somewhere out past the edge of the station, in systems most of the assembly had never bothered to think about, humanity was closing its doors, turning inward, and leaving the rest of the galaxy to discover exactly how much weight had been resting on shoulders nobody had ever properly thanked. I did not sleep that night. Neither, I suspect, did anyone else who understood what had just happened. The following morning, I was reassigned. My supervisor told me the assembly needed every available human staff member reporting directly to what they were now calling the Crisis Coordination Office, though at the time it was still just 3 rooms and a handful of exhausted analysts trying to understand what had changed overnight. I walked into that office expecting confusion. What I found was closer to panic. The first reports came in from the outer trade routes near the Kessa Belt, a cluster of mining systems that had relied on human patrol ships for nearly 30 years. Overnight, 3 separate raider groups had struck unguarded transport convoys. No human ships had been there to intervene, because there were no human ships left in the sector at all. The local system defense forces, small and poorly equipped, had never needed to be strong before. They had never needed to be, because humanity had always been there first. By midday, similar reports were arriving from 4 other border regions. Nothing had happened to those regions overnight that had not been possible before. What had changed was that the deterrent was gone. The predators of the galaxy, and there were more of them than most species liked to admit, had simply been waiting for an opening. I spent that first day reading incident reports until my eyes burned, and by the time I left the office that night, I understood something that would only get clearer over the following weeks. Humanity had not just been one voice among many in galactic politics. Humanity had been the glue holding 100 fragile arrangements together, quietly, without praise, and almost entirely unnoticed until it disappeared. Nobody in that chamber the day before had believed anything would actually change. They were about to learn otherwise. Late that second night, I stayed behind in the crisis office after everyone else had gone. I told myself I was catching up on reports, but the truth is, I could not stop thinking about Grace Whitfield's face when she said the word done. I had worked under her for 2 years. I had never once heard her raise her voice, and I had never once seen her make a decision this large without warning her own staff first. That told me something the reports could not. This was not a sudden reaction. This had been planned for a long time, quietly, by people who understood exactly what would happen once they stepped back. A message arrived on my terminal a little after midnight. It was from a woman named Priya Sandhu, an old colleague who now worked inside the Human Concordat's Home Affairs Division, far from the assembly and its endless meetings. She did not waste time with pleasantries. "You are seeing it already, aren't you?" she wrote. "The raids, the relay failures. It is only going to get worse from here. I need you to understand something, Ethan, because you are still there and we are not. This was never about anger. It was about respect. For 80 years we absorbed the risk so other species could enjoy the safety. We paid the cost so others could avoid it. And every single time we were reminded that we were still outsiders, still too young, still too dangerous to be trusted with a real voice. So we stopped paying that cost. That is all this is." I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since the chamber went silent the day before. Is there any point where we go back? Her answer came almost a full minute later, as if she had needed the time to choose her words carefully. "Maybe," she wrote, "but only if they finally understand what they lost, not before." I closed the terminal and sat alone in the dim office for a long while, listening to the quiet hum of machines still processing incident reports from systems most people in the assembly could not even locate on a star chart. Somewhere out there, convoys were being raided, colonies were losing contact with their supply lines, and ancient rivalries that had been kept in check for a century were beginning, very quietly, to stir again. None of it had happened because humanity attacked anyone. None of it had happened because humanity threatened anyone. It happened simply because humanity stopped showing up, and the galaxy discovered, all at once, how much it had been leaning on a single quiet, overworked, and deeply underestimated species. I did not know it yet, but this was only the very beginning. The systems failing that week were the smallest and least protected ones. The larger, more dangerous failures were still ahead of us, waiting just past the horizon, and they would not stay quiet for long. The relay station above Corvan Station went dark without warning, and for 6 hours, an entire sector of the galaxy lost the ability to communicate faster than light. I remember the exact moment the alert came through, because the room full of analysts around me went completely silent, and then everyone started talking at once. The Corvan Relay was not a small station. It was one of the 7 main hubs that carried nearly a third of all interstellar communication and trade coordination across the central systems. Humanity had built it, humanity had upgraded it twice, and humanity had quietly maintained it for 11 years without a single major failure. Most species using it every day did not even know it required maintenance at all. They assumed it simply worked, the way people assume the sun will rise without asking who keeps it burning. Now it did not work, and nobody left behind knew how to fix it. I was sent, along with 2 assembly technicians, to observe a repair attempt from a nearby transit station. We were not allowed to help. That was one of the strict new rules the human Concordat had put in place before withdrawing. No human engineer would offer emergency assistance to any relay station, trade route, or peacekeeping operation without a formal treaty renegotiation first. It sounded cold when I first read it. After watching that repair attempt, I understood it as something closer to necessary. The lead technician was a Valethi engineer named Dessa Kor, calm and clearly skilled in her own field, but completely unfamiliar with human relay architecture. She and her team worked for nearly 9 hours straight, running diagnostic after diagnostic, trying to understand a system built on principles nobody outside the human Concordat had ever been taught. At one point, she turned toward the observation window where I was standing and asked, through the translator, whether I could explain even the basic power routing structure. I was under strict instruction not to answer. I still remember how that felt, standing there in silence while someone visibly exhausted and increasingly desperate asked me a simple technical question I absolutely knew the answer to. It was not satisfying. It was not something to be proud of. It was simply the cost of a decision that had already been made, and I was only there to watch it play out. By the end of that first week, 4 more relay stations had gone offline in different sectors, each one maintained differently, each one revealing a slightly different gap in knowledge that no other species had bothered to fill because humanity had always filled it for them. Meanwhile, the raids along the outer trade routes were getting worse, not better. What had started as small opportunistic attacks near the Kessa Belt had spread to at least a dozen other border regions. Local defense forces, some of them barely more than lightly armed transport escorts, were being overwhelmed faster than local governments could respond. I read one report from a mining colony called Yulthuran Outpost that described their entire supply convoy being intercepted in a single afternoon, cutting off food and medical shipments to nearly 40,000 colonists for at least 3 weeks. 40,000 people, and the news barely reached the Central Assembly at all, because for decades, problems like that had simply never happened. Human patrols had made sure of it, quietly, without ceremony, and without most of the galaxy ever noticing the danger they had been protected from. The most serious development, though, came from a much older and much more dangerous source. The Sovar Dominion and the Krythan Alliance had been circling each other with quiet hostility for over a century. Their conflict predated most other species in the Assembly, rooted in territorial disputes so old that even their own historians disagreed on how it began. For nearly 100 years, the only reason open conflict had never returned was a series of careful, patient, and largely thankless mediation efforts led almost entirely by human diplomats. Grace Whitfield herself had spent nearly a decade of her career working directly with both governments, building trust piece by piece, smoothing over incidents that could easily have spiraled into full conflict if handled poorly. She had done this work quietly, without much recognition, while critics in the Assembly accused humanity of interfering in matters that were not their concern. Now that mediation was gone, and both empires seemed to sense it almost immediately. Reports began arriving of Sovar patrol ships pushing further into contested border regions than they had in decades. The Krythan Alliance responded by moving several war fleets into a defensive posture along their shared frontier. Neither side had crossed a line that could not be walked back. Not yet, but the tension in those reports was impossible to ignore. It read like two old rivals who had been kept apart by a firm, steady hand for years, testing the boundaries the moment that hand let go. I brought this specific report directly to my new supervisor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Sandhu's counterpart within the Assembly office, a Talarian administrator named Oren Vask. He read through it twice before setting it down on his desk. "This is the one that worries me," he said. "Pirates raiding trade routes is a tragedy, but it is contained. If the Sovar and the Krythan return to open conflict, it will not stay contained. It never has before." "Can anyone else mediate?" I asked. "Any other species with enough trust from both sides?" Oren looked at me for a long moment before shaking his head slowly. "No one else ever built that trust," he said. "That was always the human role. Nobody else wanted the job. It was slow, thankless work, mediating between two empires who barely tolerated outsiders at all. Humanity did it anyway, for years, without asking for much in return. And now we find out exactly how much that mattered. Word of the situation eventually reached the highest levels of the Assembly, and for the first time since the withdrawal, I began hearing quiet, careful conversations in the hallways about the need to reach out to humanity directly. Not through official channels, not through formal treaty proposals that would take months to draft and vote on, but through some kind of direct, informal contact that could move quickly. I was not part of those early conversations, not at first. I was simply an aide, reading reports and passing along summaries to people with far more authority than I had. But 3 weeks after the withdrawal, Oren Vask called me into his office and told me something I had not expected at all. "There is a delegation being formed," he said. "Small, quiet, mostly symbolic at this stage, meant to travel to human space and attempt to reopen some form of communication. Given your background working directly under Ambassador Whitfield, your presence has been requested." I remember feeling a strange mixture of pride and fear settle into my chest at the same time. Pride, because someone believed I could be useful in a moment this important. Fear, because I understood, more than most of the delegates likely did, exactly how firm humanity's decision had been. "What makes anyone think they will even agree to see us?" I asked. Oren exhaled slowly, glancing toward the window where a dozen relay repair ships sat uselessly docked outside, still unable to restore full communication across half the galaxy. "Nothing makes us think that," he admitted. "But we no longer have the luxury of waiting to find out. Every day we delay, more colonies lose supply lines, more border regions destabilize, and the Sovar and Krythan frontier grows more tense. Someone has to try, Ethan, and it might as well be someone who actually understands them." I left his office that evening with a formal travel assignment in hand, and a growing sense of dread I could not quite shake. Word had already spread through the crisis office that the delegation would depart within the week, traveling to the edge of human territory, with no guarantee of even being granted an audience, let alone a meaningful conversation. That night, I sent one more message to Priya Sandhu, unsure whether she would even respond given how busy her division had likely become. "I have been asked to join a delegation heading toward human space," I wrote. "I do not know what to expect." Her reply came faster than I anticipated. "Expect politeness," she wrote. "Expect patience. Do not expect us to change our minds easily. We did not make this decision quickly, Ethan, and we will not undo it quickly either. But if you are the one they send, at least I know someone honest will be standing in that room." I read that message several times before finally setting my terminal aside and trying, unsuccessfully, to sleep. 5 days later, our small delegation boarded a transport ship bound for the border of human space, carrying with us the growing weight of a galaxy that had finally begun to understand, far too late, exactly what it had lost. The journey to the border of human space took 9 days, and for most of that time, our delegation sat in tense, uncertain silence. There were 6 of us in total. Oren Vask led the group, along with 2 senior diplomats from older, more established species, a communications officer, a security escort who had almost nothing to do, and me. I was the only one on that ship who had ever actually worked alongside humans in any meaningful capacity, and I could feel that fact pressing on me the closer we got to our destination. I remember watching the star charts update on the main display as we crossed into the outer edge of the human Concordat's territory. For the first time since the withdrawal began, we were no longer looking at reports of what humanity had stopped doing. We were about to see, firsthand, exactly what they had built instead. What we found did not match anything I had expected. I had imagined, perhaps foolishly, that a species pulling back from galactic cooperation might appear weakened, isolated, or struggling without the trade and support of the wider assembly. Instead, as our ship approached the outer perimeter of human territory, we were met with an automated defense network more advanced and more thoroughly integrated than anything I had seen anywhere else in the galaxy. Dozens of unmanned monitoring platforms tracked our approach in complete silence, adjusting their formations with a precision that felt almost unsettling. Our communications officer attempted contact repeatedly during the approach, sending formal requests through every standard diplomatic channel we had access to. For nearly 6 hours, we received no response at all, only a quiet, automated acknowledgement confirming that our transmission had been received and logged. I began to wonder if we would be turned away entirely, left to drift at the edge of human space with nothing to show for the journey but a very long, very quiet trip home. Then, without warning, a single response came through, brief and precise. Request received. Escort assigned. Maintain current course. Do not deviate. 2 small human vessels appeared shortly after, sleek and efficient, flanking our ship without a single wasted movement. They did not hail us again. They simply guided us forward, deeper into human territory, toward a destination our navigation systems had not been given in advance. The tension inside our own ship grew with every passing hour. Oren paced the length of the observation deck more times than I could count, reviewing his prepared statements again and again, adjusting phrases that had already been adjusted a dozen times before. The 2 senior diplomats spoke quietly to each other in hushed, clipped tones, clearly uneasy at being led somewhere without any clear understanding of what awaited us. I found myself, oddly, feeling something closer to calm the deeper we traveled. I had spent 2 years working near humans before the withdrawal. I understood, perhaps better than anyone else on that ship, that whatever waited for us would not involve unnecessary theater or intimidation. Humanity, in my experience, rarely wasted effort on displays meant only to impress. If anything worried me, it was the opposite. I worried that whatever we found would be calm, orderly, and completely indifferent to our presence. I was not entirely wrong. Our escort eventually guided us toward a mid-sized planet called Halworth, a colony world I had heard mentioned occasionally in old reports, but had never visited myself. As we descended through the atmosphere, I pressed close to the viewport, taking in a landscape that looked nothing like the struggling, isolated world some assembly analysts had predicted we might find. Hallworth was thriving. Cities stretched across wide green valleys, connected by clean, efficient transit lines. Agricultural regions extended for kilometers, in neatly organized patterns, clearly self-sufficient and clearly untouched by any shortage caused by the withdrawal. If anything, the colony looked calmer and more settled than many of the Central Assembly worlds I had visited over the years, worlds constantly strained by overcrowded trade routes and competing political interests. We landed at a modest transport facility on the outskirts of the largest city, and I remember stepping off that ship expecting some kind of formal welcome, a show of diplomatic ceremony befitting the significance of the moment. Instead, we were met by a single man standing near the edge of the landing platform, dressed in plain, practical clothing, holding a data tablet under one arm as though he had simply stepped away from an ordinary workday to greet us. His name, he told us, was Daniel Marsh, and he introduced himself not as an ambassador, not as a general, and not as any kind of senior political figure, but as a regional coordination officer for interspecies affairs, a title that sounded almost deliberately unimpressive given the weight of the moment. I watched the two senior diplomats exchange a brief, uncomfortable glance. I understood exactly what that glance meant. They had expected, perhaps even hoped, to be received by someone of significant political authority, someone whose presence alone would signal how seriously humanity was taking this meeting. Instead, they were being greeted by what amounted to a mid-level administrator, calm, polite, and entirely unbothered by the historical weight of the situation. Daniel led us through a series of quiet, efficient hallways toward a modest meeting room, nothing like the grand ceremonial chambers common throughout the assembly. There were no elaborate seals, no towering statues, no dramatic lighting meant to inspire awe, just a simple round table, comfortable chairs, and several glasses of water already waiting for us. Oren began, as he had rehearsed several times during the journey, with a formal statement expressing the Assembly's desire to reopen dialogue and address what he carefully referred to as recent misunderstandings. Daniel listened patiently, without interrupting, until Oren finished. "I appreciate the sentiment," Daniel said finally, his tone calm and entirely without hostility, "but I want to be honest with you because I think that will save all of us a great deal of time. I am not authorized to reverse any part of the withdrawal. No one at my level is. This meeting exists to listen and to relay information, nothing more." One of the senior diplomats, a Corvellan representative named Ithra Sol, leaned forward with obvious frustration. "Surely someone with actual authority could join us," she said. "This situation is far too serious to be handled by a regional coordinator." Daniel did not seem offended by the comment. If anything, he almost smiled. "I understand it may seem that way," he said, "but I think it says something important that this is who was sent to meet you. For nearly a century, some of the most difficult, dangerous, and thankless work in this galaxy was handled quietly by people at exactly this level. Engineers maintaining relay stations no one thanked us for. Patrol officers protecting trade routes that were never ours to protect. Mediators smoothing over conflicts between empires who barely tolerated our presence in the room. We never sent our most senior officials to do that work, because it did not require ceremony. It required competence, patience, and a willingness to do the job without recognition." He paused, letting that settle over the room before continuing. "You are receiving the same treatment now, not because we think this conversation is unimportant, but because we no longer believe importance requires spectacle. If you have something worth saying, I am fully capable of hearing it and relaying it accurately." The room fell silent for a long moment. I could see Oren recalibrating his approach entirely, abandoning whatever formal opening remarks he had prepared for someone of higher standing. "Relay stations across multiple sectors have failed," Oren said instead, his tone more direct now. "Trade routes along the outer border are being raided at a rate we have not seen in decades, and the frontier between the Sovar Dominion and the Krythan Alliance is destabilizing rapidly. Ambassador Whitfield spent years maintaining that peace personally. Without her involvement, without any human involvement at all, we are seeing signs that conflict may return. Daniel nodded slowly, unsurprised by any of it. "We are aware," he said. "We have been aware since the moment it began. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters more than anything else I could say in this room. None of this surprises us. We anticipated every one of these outcomes before we withdrew. We spent years quietly absorbing risks that were never truly ours to carry, simply because no one else was willing to do it, and because doing it kept the wider galaxy stable enough for everyone, including us, to continue growing." "Then why stop now?" Ithra asked, her voice sharper than before. "If you understood the consequences, why allow this to happen at all?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "Because understanding the consequences was never the same as accepting them forever," he said. "For 80 years, we absorbed those risks while being told, consistently and often quite openly, that we did not belong at the same table as the species we were protecting. We were called reckless, dangerous, too young to be trusted with real influence. And yet we were trusted enough to patrol your trade routes, maintain your communication networks, and prevent wars between empires far older than we are. That contradiction became impossible to accept indefinitely." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "This is not punishment," he continued. "It is not an attempt to force concessions through crisis. It is simply the natural result of a choice we no longer wished to make silently. We removed ourselves from responsibilities that were never formally ours, and the galaxy is now discovering how much of its stability depended on us choosing, every single day, to carry weight nobody ever officially asked us to carry." I watched the two senior diplomats struggle to respond, their prepared arguments clearly built around the assumption that humanity's withdrawal was some kind of tactical maneuver, a bold opening move in a negotiation meant to extract better terms. Daniel's calm, direct honesty seemed to unsettle them more than any show of strength could have. Oren finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. "What would it take," he asked, "for humanity to reconsider even partial involvement? Not full restoration of previous agreements. Simply enough to stabilize the most urgent crises, particularly the Sovar and Krythan frontier." Daniel studied him for a long moment before answering. "I cannot promise anything at my level," he said, "but I can tell you what I believe leadership would want to hear, based on years of watching how this decision was made. They will not respond to pressure. They will not respond to guilt. And they will certainly not respond to any offer framed as temporary convenience, something meant only to calm this specific crisis, before returning to business as usual once the danger passes." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "If there is ever a path back to meaningful cooperation, it will require something the Assembly has never seriously offered before: genuine partnership, real authority within your councils, not a symbolic seat used mainly to reassure member species that humanity is technically included. Respect that does not disappear the moment the crisis you are currently facing is resolved." The room remained quiet after that, each of us absorbing the weight of what he had said. I found myself thinking, not for the first time since the withdrawal began, that this entire situation had never truly been about power or control. It had been about recognition, plain and simple, something the Assembly had consistently failed to offer, despite relying on humanity, for nearly everything that kept it stable. Before we left Halworth, Daniel offered one final piece of information, delivered with the same calm, measured tone he had used throughout the entire meeting. "There is one thing I think you should know," he said. "We have not withdrawn from every relationship equally. Smaller species who treated us with genuine respect, even when it was not politically convenient to do so, have not been abandoned entirely. Quiet, informal arrangements remain in place with a handful of them. Nothing official, nothing that violates the terms of our withdrawal. Simply a recognition that some relationships were built on mutual respect rather than convenience, and those relationships have not been discarded." I thought immediately of the Ilvans, a smaller, gentler species who had always treated human delegates with warmth, even when larger empires dismissed humanity as unworthy of serious consideration. I wondered if they were among the species Daniel was referring to, and something in his brief, careful expression told me I was likely right. As our ship departed Halworth and began the long journey back toward the assembly, I found myself staring out at the stars, turning over everything Daniel had said. This was not a bluff. It was not a temporary tantrum meant to force a quick apology and an even quicker return to old arrangements. It was a deliberate, carefully considered policy, built over years of quiet frustration, and it was already working exactly as intended. The galaxy had spent decades assuming humanity's presence was permanent, unconditional, and guaranteed regardless of how they were treated. That assumption had just been proven catastrophically wrong, and there was no indication, none at all, that humanity intended to correct that assumption anytime soon. Oren sat across from me during the final stretch of the journey, unusually quiet, staring at his own reflection in the darkened viewport. "We built our entire understanding of stability around a species we barely respected," he said finally, more to himself than to me. "And now we have to find a way to earn back something we should have valued from the very beginning." I did not have an answer for him. I am not sure one existed yet. All I knew, as our ship carried us back toward a galaxy growing more unstable by the day, was that the real difficulty was only just beginning, and the price of correcting decades of quiet disrespect was going to be far higher than anyone in that chamber had ever imagined. When we returned to the assembly, the atmosphere had shifted from confusion into something closer to controlled panic. Word of our meeting with Daniel Marsh had spread quickly through diplomatic circles, and while the details were still limited to senior staff, the message was clear enough. Humanity was not bluffing, and no amount of pressure was going to change that fact. Oren submitted a full report within a day of our return, and I was asked to sit quietly in the back of the session where it was formally presented to the wider council. I watched as delegate after delegate reacted with a strange mixture of disbelief and growing dread, as if they had spent the last month expecting this entire situation to resolve itself without any real cost to them personally. Senator Cale Dorsa, the same Trellian official who had mocked humanity so openly weeks earlier, stood to speak almost immediately after the report concluded. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice sharp with frustration. "We cannot simply accept that an entire species has chosen to abandon its responsibilities based on hurt feelings. There must be leverage we can apply, trade restrictions, formal condemnation, something that forces a reconsideration." Ithra Sol, who had been present with us on Halworth, responded before anyone else could. "With respect, Senator," she said, "I do not think you understand the tone of that meeting. This was not emotional. It was not impulsive. It was calculated, patient, and entirely deliberate. Threatening trade restrictions against a species that no longer depends on our trade routes will accomplish nothing except confirming everything they already believe about how we treat them." Cale did not seem convinced, and over the following days, several attempts were made regardless, mostly by delegates who still believed pressure could force a quick resolution. Formal condemnations were drafted and passed, with hollow unanimous votes. Trade proposals were floated, offering favorable terms in exchange for renewed cooperation. Every single attempt received the same calm, polite, and completely unmoved response from human representatives, an acknowledgement that the message had been received, followed by nothing further. Meanwhile, the crises we had been sent to address only continued to grow worse. I spent most evenings that week reviewing incident reports from the Sovar and Krithan frontier, watching the tension escalate almost day by day. What had started as cautious posturing along contested borders had progressed into direct confrontations between patrol fleets. No formal declaration of conflict had been made yet, but two separate incidents involving weapons fire between Sovar and Krithan vessels had already occurred, each one narrowly avoiding a larger confrontation through sheer luck rather than any deliberate restraint. During one particularly tense session, Oren received an unexpected message routed through diplomatic channels, forwarded from a private contact within the Ilvan delegation. He read it quietly at his desk before calling me in to share what he had learned. "The Ilvans have been offered quiet technical assistance," he said, sliding the message across for me to read. "Nothing official, no formal treaty, simply an informal arrangement allowing continued access to certain medical and communication support they had previously received through joint agreements." I remembered immediately what Daniel Marsh had told us on Halworth, about relationships built on genuine respect rather than convenience. The Ilvans had always treated human delegates with warmth, even during years when doing so was not politically fashionable among larger, more dismissive empires. It seemed humanity had not forgotten that. "So it is true," I said. "This is not isolation, it is selective withdrawal." Oren nodded slowly. "It confirms what Daniel told us," he said. "This was never about punishing everyone equally. It was about refusing to continue supporting relationships built entirely on convenience and disrespect, while maintaining the ones built on something more genuine. That distinction mattered more than most delegates seemed willing to acknowledge. It proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that humanity's withdrawal was not simple anger lashing out indiscriminately. It was a considered, deliberate response to years of being taken for granted, applied with surprising precision. The following week brought the crisis point everyone had been quietly dreading. A larger confrontation erupted along the Sovar and Cretan frontier, beginning with a disputed mining outpost that both empires claimed as their own. What should have been a contained territorial dispute, the kind that had been mediated calmly and quietly for decades by human diplomats, spiraled rapidly out of control without anyone present capable of applying the same steady, trusted hand. Within hours, both sides had mobilized significant portions of their war fleets toward the contested region. Emergency sessions were called throughout the assembly, filled with desperate attempts to find any mediator both empires might trust enough to step in before the situation escalated further. No one could be found. I sat in the crisis office late into the night, watching real-time updates scroll across multiple screens, each one more alarming than the last. Reports indicated that both the Sovar Dominion and the Cretan Alliance possessed weapons capable of causing catastrophic, potentially irreversible damage if deployed at full scale, the kind of devastation that could destabilize an entire region of space for generations. Oren arrived sometime after midnight, his expression grim. "The Council is preparing an emergency session," he said. "There is discussion of formally reaching out to humanity again, this time with a proposal far more substantial than anything offered so far." "What kind of proposal?" I asked. "A genuine seat," he said. "Full voting authority within the Security Council. Not symbolic, not conditional, equal standing alongside the oldest and most established species in the Assembly." I felt something tighten in my chest, a mixture of hope and disbelief. "After everything Daniel told us," I said, "do you think that will be enough?" Oren exhaled slowly, rubbing his eyes with obvious exhaustion. "I do not know," he admitted, "but it is the first offer in this entire crisis that actually matches the scale of what was lost. Perhaps that matters more than we realize." The emergency session convened the following morning, filled with a tension unlike anything I had witnessed since the original withdrawal announcement weeks earlier. Delegate after delegate rose to speak, many of them the very same voices who had once dismissed humanity as unworthy of serious influence within the Assembly. Senator Cale Dorsa, notably, remained silent throughout most of the session, his earlier confidence entirely absent. When he finally did speak, his tone was markedly different from the dismissive arrogance he had displayed weeks before. "I was wrong," he said quietly, the admission clearly difficult for him. "I believed humanity's absence would be inconvenient, perhaps costly, but ultimately manageable. I did not understand how much of our stability depended on their quiet, consistent presence. I do not say this easily, but I believe a genuine, meaningful seat is not simply owed to them. It is necessary for our continued survival." Comedy. The vote that followed passed with an overwhelming majority, a stark contrast to the hollow condemnations issued in the days immediately following the withdrawal. For the first time in the Assembly's long history, a formal offer was drafted granting humanity full, permanent, unconditional standing within the Security Council, along with a sincere, detailed acknowledgement of the decades of undervalued contributions that had kept the galaxy stable. I was asked, along with Orin and Ithra, to personally deliver the proposal to human representatives, given our previous meeting with Daniel Marsh on Hallworth. The journey back to human space felt different this time. There was no lingering uncertainty about whether we would even receive a response. What remained uncertain was whether the offer, however genuine, would arrive too late to matter, or whether it would be enough to convince a species that had spent decades being quietly dismissed to finally believe the galaxy had actually changed. As our ship crossed once again into human territory, I found myself thinking back to Priya Sandhu's message from weeks earlier, the one she had sent me the night the withdrawal first began. Maybe, she had written, but only if they finally understand what they lost. Not before. I hoped, more than I had hoped for almost anything in my career, that this moment finally represented that understanding. We arrived back on Hallworth 2 days later, and this time, the reception was different from the start. Daniel Marsh met us again at the same landing platform, but he was not alone this time. Standing beside him, dressed in simple, practical clothing much like his own, was Grace Whitfield. Seeing her again after everything that had happened felt strange, almost disorienting. The woman who had walked away from that assembly podium weeks earlier, calm and resolute, looked exactly the same now, unchanged by the chaos her decision had set into motion across the galaxy. "Ethan," she said, her tone warm despite the seriousness of the moment, "I heard you were part of this delegation. I am glad it was you." "Ambassador," I said, unsure of exactly how to address her given her current status, "we have brought a formal proposal from the Assembly. I believe you already know what it contains." She nodded slightly. "We have been informed of its general terms." "Yes, but I would like to hear it directly, from you and your colleagues, before we proceed any further." We were led once again to the same modest meeting room, though this time several other human officials joined the discussion, along with 2 representatives I recognized from the Ilvan delegation, present as observers given their ongoing informal relationship with humanity throughout the crisis. Orin presented the proposal carefully, detailing every element the Assembly had agreed upon: a full, permanent, unconditional seat on the Security Council, equal voting authority alongside the oldest species in the galaxy, a formal, publicly documented acknowledgement of decades of undervalued contributions, along with a binding commitment to ensure future agreements reflected genuine partnership rather than convenient dependency. Grace listened without interrupting, her expression carefully neutral throughout the entire presentation. When Orin finished, the room fell into a long, heavy silence. "This is a significant offer," she said finally. "More significant than anything we have received in the entire history of our involvement with this assembly. I want to be honest with you, as Daniel was during your previous visit. This alone does not guarantee our return to previous levels of cooperation." Ithra Sol leaned forward, clearly troubled. What more could possibly be required? Grace considered the question carefully before answering. "Commitments on paper have been broken before," she said. "Not by us, but by others within this assembly, more times than I can count. A seat means very little if the moment this current crisis passes, humanity finds itself quietly pushed back toward the margins once stability returns. I need to understand what mechanism exists to ensure that does not happen again." Orin had clearly anticipated this concern, and he answered without hesitation. "The proposal includes binding structural changes," he said. "Not simply a symbolic seat, but permanent representation within every major committee responsible for trade regulation, border security, and interspecies mediation. Removal or reduction of that representation would require an outcome that has never once occurred in the Assembly's history: unanimous consent from every founding species, including humanity itself." Grace exchanged a brief glance with Daniel before continuing. "That is a meaningful safeguard," she admitted, "but structural changes alone will not repair the deeper issue. Respect cannot be legislated into existence through committee assignments. It has to be demonstrated, consistently, over time." I found myself speaking before I had fully decided to, the words coming out with more conviction than I expected. "Then let us demonstrate it," I said, "not through promises alone, but through action, starting immediately." The Sovar and Krythan frontier is on the edge of open conflict right now, today, while we sit in this room discussing terms. If there is any single act that could prove the Assembly's sincerity, it would be inviting humanity to lead that mediation once again, not as a favor being requested, but as an equal partner whose expertise is being genuinely valued. The room went quiet again, and I felt my pulse quicken, uncertain whether I had overstepped my role as a junior aide speaking so directly in front of senior officials from both sides. Grace studied me for a long moment before a small, thoughtful smile crossed her face. "That is precisely the kind of demonstration I meant," she said. "Not empty words, but immediate, meaningful action taken under real pressure, when it would be far easier to simply wait and see how the crisis resolves itself." She turned to Daniel, exchanging a brief, quiet conversation in low tones before addressing the delegation directly. "We will send a mediation team to the Sovar and Krythan frontier immediately," she said. "Not as a formal reinstatement of previous agreements, not yet, but as a direct demonstration of good faith, contingent on the Assembly following through on every structural commitment outlined in this proposal, without delay or modification." Oren agreed immediately, and within hours, the terms were finalized and transmitted back to the Assembly for emergency ratification. I remained on Halworth along with the rest of our delegation as the vote took place remotely, watching the results scroll across a secure terminal with a tension I had not felt since the very beginning of this entire crisis. The proposal passed unanimously, without a single dissenting vote, a result that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. The mediation team departed for the Sovar and Krythan frontier within 2 days, led personally by Grace Whitfield, accompanied by several experienced human diplomats who had worked alongside her during the original decades of quiet, thankless negotiation. I was permitted to join the support staff for that mission, given my previous involvement throughout the crisis, and I remember boarding that transport with a strange combination of exhaustion and cautious hope. The frontier itself, when we arrived, looked exactly as tense as the reports had described. Sovar and Krythan fleets sat positioned on opposite sides of the contested mining outpost, weapons systems active, awaiting orders that could ignite a conflict capable of devastating the entire region. Grace requested separate meetings with representatives from both empires, conducted with the same calm, patient authority I remembered from her final address in the Assembly chamber weeks earlier. I was not present for those private discussions, but I watched from the support ship as hours passed slowly, tension hanging heavily over the entire fleet formation. Late into the second day, word finally came through. Both empires had agreed to a temporary ceasefire, allowing time for a full, formal mediation process to begin, the first genuine step toward resolving a conflict that had been building steadily since the moment humanity's original withdrawal left the frontier without its usual steady hand. Over the following weeks, that mediation process continued carefully, methodically, exactly as it had for decades before the crisis began. Slowly, the immediate danger of open conflict receded, replaced once again by the fragile, patient diplomacy that had kept these two ancient rivals apart for over a century. Meanwhile, back within the Assembly, the structural changes outlined in the proposal began taking effect. Human representatives were formally seated within every major committee, their input given equal weight alongside species who had, only weeks earlier, dismissed their contributions as unnecessary or unwelcome. Relay stations across multiple sectors slowly returned to full functionality, this time maintained through joint teams combining human expertise with local engineers eager to finally learn the systems they had always taken for granted. Trade routes along the outer border regions saw renewed patrols, not through unconditional favors extended by an overworked species absorbing every risk alone, but through properly negotiated agreements involving shared responsibility, shared cost, and shared credit for maintaining galactic stability. I remained involved throughout this transition period, watching with quiet satisfaction as relationships that had once been built on convenience slowly began transforming into something closer to genuine partnership. It did not happen overnight, and it certainly did not happen without lingering tension and occasional setbacks. Old habits, old assumptions, and old prejudices did not disappear simply because a treaty had been signed. But something fundamental had changed, something I do not believe could have happened without the crisis forcing every reluctant species within the assembly to confront exactly how much they had relied on a species they had never bothered to properly respect. Several months after the frontier ceasefire was finalized, I found myself once again standing in the main assembly chamber, though this time under very different circumstances. Grace Whitfield stood at the podium, no longer as a departing delegate announcing withdrawal, but as the newly seated permanent representative for humanity within the Security Council, formally welcomed with a ceremony that felt, for once, entirely sincere rather than performative. I watched from the same position I had stood in months earlier, holding papers nobody would read, except this time, the mood in that chamber felt entirely different. There was no laughter dismissing the significance of the moment. There was no quiet condescension hiding behind polite diplomatic language. There was, instead, a careful, hard-earned respect that had been absent for far too long. After the ceremony concluded, I found Grace near the same transport terminal where I had spoken with her on that very first difficult night. "It worked," I said, "everything you were trying to accomplish." She considered my words carefully before responding, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "It is a beginning," she said, "nothing more than that yet. Respect earned under crisis can fade just as quickly once the crisis passes, if everyone involved allows it to. The real test will not be today, or even this year. It will be years from now, when the memory of this crisis has faded and old habits quietly try to return." "Do you think they will?" I asked. "Return to old habits, I mean." Grace looked out toward the stars visible through the terminal's wide viewport, her expression calm but thoughtful. "Perhaps," she admitted. "Old patterns rarely disappear completely, but I believe something important shifted during these past few months, something that cannot be easily forgotten. The galaxy learned, in the clearest possible way, exactly how much weight we had been quietly carrying, and exactly how easily that weight could be set down if we chose to walk away." She turned to look at me directly, her voice steady and certain. "That lesson will not be forgotten quickly, Ethan. Not by the species who witnessed firsthand what happens when humanity stops showing up, and not by us either. We learned something equally important during this crisis. We learned that our silence, our patience, and our quiet willingness to absorb difficulty without complaint had allowed decades of disrespect to continue unchallenged. We will not make that mistake again, regardless of how this new partnership unfolds." I thought back to that very first night, standing on this same platform, watching human shuttles depart one after another, uncertain whether the galaxy would ever recover from what had just happened. It had recovered, eventually, though not without significant cost, and not without forcing every species within that assembly to confront an uncomfortable truth they had spent decades ignoring. Humanity had never needed the galaxy nearly as much as the galaxy had needed humanity. For years, that imbalance had been hidden beneath layers of quiet condescension and unearned confidence from species who assumed their own history and status guaranteed them a permanent advantage. It had taken watching that support disappear entirely and witnessing exactly how much chaos followed in its absence for the galaxy to finally understand what had been standing quietly beside them all along. As I left the assembly chamber that evening, walking through hallways that finally felt a little more balanced than they had in years, I found myself thinking about something Priya Sandhu had written to me during those very first uncertain days of the crisis. "We did not make this decision quickly," she had said, "and we will not undo it quickly either." She had been right about that, more right than I think even she had expected. What began as a single, quiet, resolute decision to walk away had reshaped an entire galaxy's understanding of value, contribution, and respect, proving in the clearest way imaginable that sometimes the loudest lesson comes not from what a species says, but from what happens the moment they finally choose to stop speaking at all.